Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video I'm looking at a book that I had mixed feelings about, shall we say, and that is Neil Gaiman's American Gods, published in 2001. I didn't hate this book, but I was a bit underwhelmed by it for a few reasons, which I want to talk about in this video. Part 1. Summary. American Gods follows Shadow, a convict who is released from prison at the start of the novel, just after learning that his wife Laura has died in a mysterious car accident along with his best friend. On his return home, Shadow encounters the enigmatic Mr. Wednesday, who claims to be a refugee from a distant war, a former god, and the King of America. Shadow takes employment as a bodyguard for Wednesday, and the two embark on a strange journey all across America. Shadow quickly finds himself dragged into a war between the old gods of ancient mythologies and religion, and the new gods of the 21st century. Part 2. A fantasy travelogue. Neil Gaiman mentions that his intention when writing this book was to write a story about America, which was inspired by his travels across the country. I think if we're to assess the novel along these lines, it excels. Gaiman has a wonderful ability to construct atmosphere and setting throughout this novel, and you really do feel when you're travelling with Shadow through America that you're part of that place, that you're part of that world. In fact, in a lot of ways, the kind of mix of realism and fantasy that goes on in Gaiman's work reminds me a lot of the work of Clive Barker. Both of them have an uncanny ability to mingle hard-edged realism with vivid imaginative fantasy. So if you're a fan of Clive Barker or you're a fan of Gaiman, then I'd recommend, if you haven't read the other, definitely give them a try. Although I think Gaiman captures really well the atmosphere of the novel, and he really does capture the sense of travelling exhaustively through a massive country, the actual plot of the novel is a bit meandering because of this. I definitely describe this almost as a travelogue disguised or dressed up as a fantasy novel, because it seems like the travelogue, travelling, the places, are really the key thing, and the mythology and the magic is almost a backdrop to that central theme. And while that meandering quality of the novel does sort of imbue it with that sense of being a travel story, it does mean that as a reader it's a bit hard to read at times, it's a slow process, it's just not all that engaging because the plot isn't really the important thing here. So as a reader, that's definitely something to bear in mind as you're reading this book. That being said, I never found the book particularly boring to read. Yes, it meandered a lot, and that meant that as a reader I did often put it down, but I was always quite happy to pick it up at a later point. I never looked at the book and thought, oh god, this again. But I did find that I was never particularly desperate to pick it up either. It was definitely a meandering reading experience as much as it was a meandering novel. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The fact that I still wanted to pick it up is, a good thing. It's just that I wasn't desperate to pick it up because of that meandering tone. So overall, I am unsure as to whether this is a good or a bad thing to say about the book. The meanderingness accurately captures that sense of travel and makes you feel more part of that world, but at the same time, it demotivates you to pick it up a little bit, so it's hard to say really whether that's a good or a bad thing. So I'm happy just to leave it as a relatively positive. Part 3. Mythology of the Gods. So in addition to the travelogue, there is other things going on. It's a story about gods, in particular, the gods of America. The central conflict in the book is one between the old gods of mythology and religion and the new gods of the American 21st century. Some examples of those 21st century gods include a god of media and a god of technology. In this world, the existence of gods is based on whether or not people believe in those gods. And in the novel, those old gods are fading because people are starting not to believe in them, and these new gods of media and technology are the new rising gods because people believe in them. Now this is actually something that I've seen in other works. Other people do have a similar theme to this, but I do think that Gaiman does do some interesting things with this, especially when it comes to those 21st century gods, the way they depict themselves, and also with some of the ways in which those old gods are trying to adapt themselves in order to conform with those 21st century world. It's also nice when an author is able to engage with that history and that broad mythology, and Gaiman certainly is not only engaging with it and demonstrating knowledge of it, but he is doing interesting things with it. So that's something that I can definitely appreciate about this book. Another thing that Gaiman does, and a thing that I think is probably the best part of the book, is he has these little interludes throughout the book which focus on the history of a particular god or gods. Now, these actually come across more as short stories completely detached from the main narrative. And while some people might argue that that takes you out of the main narrative, that's less true here because, again, it's not really a tightly plotted novel, it's much more meandering than that. So, actually it's quite nice to have these little interludes, and I think that those interludes are some of the best and most engaging parts. First of all, it doesn't have the protagonist, which is something I'll get onto later. I don't particularly like that protagonist. And secondly, it allows Gaiman to engage with the history of these mythologies. These are definitely bits to look out for when you're reading, and I would say that they do stand on their own, even detached from the novel, as just great pieces of literature. All this being said about the gods and the mythology, I did find the central conflict between the gods to be one of the least interesting parts of the novel itself. I've already alluded a couple of times here and there to the fact that I don't think this is a particularly plot-based novel, and you can definitely see that as a reader. It's not really about the plot, and while that is fine, it does mean that the plot is sort of underwhelming, especially at the end. I really wasn't keen on the resolution of the plot. I thought it was just kind of pedestrian, maybe even lazy. It just really didn't leave a very satisfying taste in my mouth when I got to the end of the book. Part 4. The Shadow of a Protagonist. So when I talk about books with people, a lot of people that I talk to always focus on things like the relatability of the protagonist. They really want to relate to the character, and if they don't relate to them because they're evil or they're nasty or they're just very different from them, they often find that as a reason to dislike the book. Or, even worse than this, they have to have a moral protagonist, and if the protagonist is immoral, then they don't like the book as well. I definitely don't sit into either of these camps. One of my favourite books is Wuthering Heights, and in that book, most of the characters, especially the main protagonists, are nasty people, they're cruel, they're violent forces of nature. But what I like the book for is that these protagonists capture your attention throughout. They really make you engaged, even though you hate them and you think they're terrible. And that to me is the sign of a good protagonist. It doesn't necessarily mean that every protagonist needs to be this big force of nature, as the case is in Wuthering Heights. But it does mean that your protagonist needs to grab my attention and keep my interest. And that could be done by having them being a moral paragon of virtue, but it could also be done by having them to be terrible people. And either is fine, just make them interesting. Unfortunately, I did not find the protagonist in this novel, Shadow, interesting at all. First of all, his character, especially in comparison with the other characters, was very flat. He had this typical sort of macho brooding thing that didn't really go anywhere. He didn't really seem to develop much over the course of the novel, and as a reader I didn't feel like I really knew him in the novel as a whole. He was definitely somewhat of a void. Compare this to some of the other characters like Mr. Wednesday, who is really enigmatic, or a certain undead character who I won't spoil, but she is very fascinating and has an amazing amount of character growth through the novel. And you can see that Gaiman is good at writing these, complex, interesting characters. But it's a shame that the central character, the one that we have to spend most of this book, which is quite meandering, as I've said, you have to spend it with this person, it does let the book down substantially. I would have much rather have followed some of the gods in those interludes for a whole story, or followed the undead character for her story, because to me that was way more fascinating than Shadow's story. This to me I think is why I felt underwhelmed by this novel. Because it's not a plot-based novel, it's a character-based novel, or a travelogue even, it's really important that you have at the centre of that an interesting protagonist. Because otherwise, why would you care about travelling across America with someone who's boring, right? It's important that the protagonist in a character-based novel, or a setting-based novel, is engaging and interesting, because they're the person that we have to spend a lot of intimate time with. And I just didn't feel like that was the case with Shadow, although it was the case with some of those background characters, but they were merely background characters. Part 5. Conclusion. So overall, I think American Gods sits pretty much in the middle for me in terms of quality. If we take it to be a travelogue, then in terms of its style and that theme, I think it does a fantastic job, and it's definitely worth engaging with. As a fantasy novel, I think it works to an extent. There's certainly interesting mythology, there's interesting things going on, but they do take a back seat to other themes, so it's not quite as effective. In terms of characters, I did find the cast as an ensemble to be pretty excellent, especially some of the characters that I mentioned, like Mr. Wednesday and the undead character. These were great, but I did find the protagonist to be dry and not very engaging, and that to me is a big flaw in a novel that is somewhat character-based and intimate as opposed to plot-based. Overall though, I would definitely recommend this book, and I'm interested to read more Neil Gaiman because I do like his way of writing, I like his style, I like the atmosphere, and I do think he's very good at crafting great characters, even if he missed the mark in this book with the protagonist. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, 4 PM UK time. Let me know in the comments below what you think of this book and what you think of Neil Gaiman. I'm definitely planning to read more Neil Gaiman in the future, so if you're familiar with his work and there's a book that you find particularly, stand out, please let me know because I'll pick it up. As for me, that's it for today's video, so take care everyone, and I'll see you all next time.